Every man eventually faces the ghosts he's been running from. For Silas Trent, a 62-year-old cowboy with more regrets than money, that moment came unexpectedly, after a lifetime on dusty trails. Silas spent his last savings on forgotten forest land, hoping for peace. His old horse Buck had other plans. Each morning the animal circled one gnarled oak tree, never stopping, never spooked, just circling. Finally frustrated and curious, Silas dug around the roots and found an iron door in the trunk. Behind it sat a sealed cellar filled with relics from an outlaw gang he once rode with, and a letter from the woman he abandoned decades ago. What could that letter possibly say after all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn came soft through the pines, painting everything in shades of amber and gray. Silas Trent stood on the sagging porch of his cabin, coffee steaming in a chipped enamel cup, watching the mist rise from the forest floor like spirits reluctant to leave. 3 weeks he'd been here now, and the quiet still felt like a luxury he hadn't earned. The property wasn't much to look at. 40 acres of dense pine and Douglas fir, rocky soil that wouldn't grow much beyond wild grass and stubborn weeds, and a one-room cabin that leaned slightly to the east, like an old man favoring a bad hip. The roof needed patching, the windows rattled in their frames, and the stone chimney had more gaps than mortar. But it was his. The deed sat in a cigar box under his cot, next to the last of his money and a photograph he hadn't looked at in 20 years. He'd won the down payment in a poker game in Boise, of all places. 5-card draw, 3 other players who couldn't read a bluff if it wore a sign. Silas had always been good with cards, better with patience. While other men bet heavy and talked loud, he sat quiet, watching. They called him Silent back then, though for different reasons. The nickname had stuck through too many years and too many places he'd rather forget. The pot had grown to $400 by the time the last hand played out. Silas held 3 queens, and a feeling the man across from him was chasing a straight he'd never catch. When the final cards hit the table, Silas's queens took it all. He'd walked out of that saloon with enough money to make a down payment, and the knowledge he'd never set foot in another card game. A man pushes his luck too far, and luck has a way of pushing back. The property seller had been a nervous fellow, thin as a rail and twice as straight, with wire-rimmed spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. He'd seemed almost relieved when Silas showed up with cash, asking no questions about why forest land this far from anything was going so cheap. "Been in my family 40 years, the man had said, shuffling papers with ink-stained fingers. "My father won it in a game of chance. Never did much with it. Too remote for logging, too rough for farming. Just sits there." Silas had signed the papers with the name he'd been using for the last 15 years, watched the man count the money twice, and taken the deed without ceremony. The seller had paused at the door, adjusting those spectacles one more time. "Fair warning," he'd said, voice dropping. "Folks around here say there's been strange happenings on that land. Nothing specific, mind you, just a feeling. My father always said the forest keeps its secrets and wise men let it." Silas had nodded, untroubled. He'd spent the better part of his life keeping secrets himself. If the forest wanted company in that regard, they'd get along fine. The cabin's previous occupants, if there had been any, left little trace. A rusted bed frame, a wobbly table, and a wood stove that still worked once he cleaned out 3 decades of bird nests and debris. He'd bought basic supplies in the nearest town, 20 miles down a rutted road that tested Buck's patience and his own aging bones. Flour, coffee, salt, dried beans, and ammunition for the Winchester he kept over the door. Not that he expected trouble, but old habits died harder than old men. Buck nickered from the lean-to Silas had hammered together on the cabin's north side. The horse was 18 now, grey creeping into his muzzle like frost on dark earth. They'd been together 14 years, since Silas found him half-starved on an abandoned ranch in Utah. Buck had been young then, just 4 years old, and already twice betrayed by men who saw him as a tool rather than a partner. Silas had spent 3 months earning the animal's trust, feeding him by hand, speaking soft words, never raising his voice or his hand. They'd covered a lot of ground together since then. Wyoming to California, north through Oregon, east to Colorado, always moving, never settling. Silas had worked ranches when he needed money, dealt cards when ranching dried up, and moved on before anyone could ask too many questions or remember a wanted poster from 30 years back. But age catches every runner, eventually. His knees complained on cold mornings, his back seized up after a day's work, and his hands cramped when he tried to rope cattle. More than that, he was tired. Tired of looking over his shoulder. Tired of new towns and suspicious faces. Tired of sleeping with one eye open and his gun within. Reach, the forest property, promised something. Different. Isolation, peace. A place where his past couldn't follow because there was no one around to remember it. He finished his coffee, tossed the dregs into the dirt, and walked to the lean-to. Buck raised his head, ears forward, eyes bright despite his age. Silas ran a hand down the horse's neck, feeling the solid warmth of muscle and bone, the steady rhythm of breathing that had been his one constant all these years. "Morning, old friend," he said quietly. "Ready for another day of not much?" Buck snorted, which Silas took as agreement. Their routine had settled quickly. Mornings began with coffee and a slow walk through the property. Checking fence lines, Silas was gradually repairing, clearing fallen branches and familiarizing himself with every tree and rock and stream. The land had a personality, he'd discovered. The pines whispered different messages depending on the wind. The creek in the southwest corner ran loud after rain and gentle in dry spells. And there was the oak tree. It stood alone in a natural clearing, about 200 yards from the cabin, surrounded by a perfect circle of bare ground, where nothing else grew. The tree itself was ancient, maybe 200 years old, its trunk thick as a wagon, and its branches spreading wide enough to shade a small barn. The bark was deeply furrowed, almost black in places, and the limbs twisted in ways that suggested the tree had weathered storms that would have broken lesser growth. Silas had noticed the bare ground first. No grass, no pine needles, no moss or lichen. Just hard-packed earth forming that perfect circle. It struck him as odd, but nature had its ways. Maybe something in the oak's roots poisoned the soil. Maybe the clearing had once been used for something, and the ground never recovered. He'd seen stranger things. What he hadn't expected was Buck's fascination with it. The first time they'd walked past the oak, Buck had stopped so suddenly Silas nearly collided with him. The horse stood perfectly still, head high, ears locked forward, staring at the tree as if it had spoken his name. "Come on, boy," Silas had urged. Nothing there but wood and bark, but Buck hadn't moved. He'd taken one step forward, then another, then begun to circle the tree. Not frantically, not spooked, just walking that perfect circle where the earth was bare, his hooves falling in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. Silas had watched, puzzled, then given a short whistle. Buck had broken the circle immediately and returned to his side, calm as ever. Silas had dismissed it as horse curiosity. Animals had their quirks. Maybe Buck smelled something, some scent memory from another time and place, but the next morning, when Silas looked out from the porch, Buck stood at the clearing's edge. As he watched, the horse began to circle again. Slow, measured, never stopping, never rushing. 3 complete circles, then Buck returned to the lean-to as if nothing had happened. The third morning, the same. The fourth, the same. By the end of the first week, it had become part of their routine. Buck would leave the lean-to at dawn, walk to the oak, circle it 3 times, and return. If Silas tried to interrupt, Buck would wait patiently until released, then go straight back to complete his ritual. By the second week, Silas found it unsettling. By the third week, sitting here on the porch with his morning coffee, watching Buck make his deliberate circles in the rising light, he found it downright disturbing. Horses didn't do that. Animals didn't develop rituals around trees for no reason. There was something about that oak, something Buck sensed that Silas couldn't. The question was whether that something mattered, or whether he should just accept it as one more strange thing in a strange world and let it be. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist. A crow called from somewhere deep in the pines, harsh and insistent. Silas set down his cup and descended the porch steps, each board creaking under his weight. His boots crunched on the needles and small stones that littered the ground between the cabin and the clearing. Buck completed his third circle and stopped, facing Silas, with an expression that seemed almost expectant. Silas approached slowly, one hand extended, and Buck met him halfway, pressing his forehead against Silas's chest in that gesture of trust they'd developed over the years. "What is it, boy?" Silas asked, looking past the horse to the massive oak. "What do you see that I don't?" The tree stood silent, its branches moving slightly in the morning breeze. Silas walked closer, running his eyes over the trunk, the roots, the bare earth. Nothing seemed out of place. Old bark, old wood, old roots digging deep into old soil. That was all, but Buck circled it every morning like it was the most important thing in the world. Silas placed his palm flat against the trunk. The bark was rough, warm from the sun, solid. Just a tree, just wood, nothing more, except somewhere in the back of his mind, in that place where instinct lived deeper than thought, something whispered that Buck was right to pay attention. Something whispered that this tree held secrets, and secrets had a way of demanding acknowledgement. Whether a man wanted to give it or not, he pulled his hand back and returned to the cabin, Buck following close behind. Work needed doing. The south wall needed chinking. The stovepipe needed cleaning, and he'd noticed a leak in the roof above his cot during the last rain. A man could spend all day staring at a tree and wondering, or he could spend the day doing something useful. But as he gathered his tools and planned his work, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Not his time, necessarily, though at 62 that was always a consideration. Something else, some countdown he couldn't see, ticking toward a moment when Buck's circles would lead to something that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. The deed in the cigar box under his cot had seemed like an ending when he'd signed it. A place to stop running, to rest, to let the world forget Silas, Silent Trent ever existed. But standing here in the morning light, watching Buck graze contentedly as if circling ancient oaks was the most natural thing in the world, Silas wondered if he'd bought an ending or a beginning, and whether, after everything he'd run from, he was finally ready to face whatever came next. 2 weeks into his new life, Buck's behavior changed. It started small. Instead of 3 measured circles each morning, the horse began making 4, then 5, then losing count altogether. Where before he'd circled and returned to the lean-to within 10 minutes, now he stayed at the clearing for an hour or more, walking that same path around the oak with a persistence that bordered on obsession. Silas tried ignoring it. Then he tried coaxing Buck away with grain and fresh water. Then he tried staking the horse on a long line on the opposite side of the property. Buck would stand quietly until Silas turned his back, then pull free and return to the oak, dragging the stake behind him. On the morning of the 16th day, Silas woke to find Buck already at the tree, circling in the pre-dawn darkness. The horse had been there since sometime in the night, his tracks in the dew-wet earth forming a trench where countless hooves had worn the ground down. "That's enough," Silas said, walking out in his union suit and boots, lantern in hand. "You're going to wear yourself out, and I'm running out of patience." Buck didn't stop. He completed another circuit, then another, his breathing steady, his pace unchanged. When Silas stepped into his path, Buck simply went around him, never breaking stride, never acknowledging his presence beyond the minimum required to avoid collision. It was that moment, being treated as just another obstacle to circle around, that convinced Silas something was genuinely wrong. In 14 years together, Buck had never ignored him, never treated him as irrelevant. The horse trusted him completely, and that trust was mutual. But now Buck trusted something else more. Something about this tree, this clearing, this ground. Silas spent the day watching, trying to see what Buck saw. He examined every inch of the trunk from ground to as high as he could reach. He walked the circle Buck traced, feeling for soft spots in the earth or variations in the soil. He tapped the trunk with his knuckles, listening for hollow spaces. Nothing seemed out of place, yet Buck circled on hour after hour, pausing only to drink from the bucket Silas brought him. By evening, Silas's frustration had given way to genuine concern. The horse was exhausting himself. His coat was dark with sweat despite the cool air, and his eyes had taken on a distant quality that worried Silas more than the circling itself. This wasn't normal behavior. This was compulsion, maybe even desperation. "All right," Silas said, standing in the clearing as the sun touched the western horizon. "You win. I'll look. I'll dig if that's what you want. Just stop this before you hurt yourself." Buck completed one more circle, then stopped directly in front of Silas and pressed his forehead against the man's chest. The gesture was so deliberate, so clearly communicative, that Silas felt the hair on his arms rise. The horse was trying to tell him something. Had been trying for weeks. Silas returned to the cabin for his shovel, a pickaxe, and a stronger lantern. The sun was setting fast, but he wouldn't sleep tonight anyway, not with Buck like this. Better to put the sleeplessness to use. He started at the base of the trunk, where Buck had been pawing the ground. The earth came up easily at first, loose and dry from being trampled. But 6 inches down, he hit roots, thick, gnarled things that spread like wooden fingers through the soil. He worked carefully, not wanting to damage the tree, cutting away smaller roots and working around the larger ones. An hour passed, 2. The stars came out brilliant and cold, and somewhere in the forest, an owl called to its mate. Silas dug deeper, following the massive central roots down and out, clearing earth from around the trunk's base. It was the sound that stopped him. His shovel struck something that rang instead of thudded. Metal, not wood. He dropped to his knees, setting the lantern close. Brushing away soil with his hands, iron. Dark with rust but unmistakably iron. He cleared more earth, following the metal's edge, and his breath caught. It was a door, not beside the tree or near the tree, but in the tree, set into the trunk itself, as if the oak had grown around it over decades, making it part of its own structure. The door was maybe 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, forged from thick iron plates riveted together. A heavy lock hung from a hasp, rusted nearly solid but still intact. Silas sat back on his heels, mind reeling. Someone had built this. Decades ago, maybe longer, they'd hollowed out part of this massive oak and installed a door. Then they'd buried it, disguised it, let the tree grow over it until it seemed like nothing more than twisted bark and ancient wood. But why? And who? He brought the lantern closer, examining the door's surface. The iron was pitted with age, but there were marks on it, deliberate scratches forming a pattern. He brushed away more dirt, and the pattern became clear, a symbol. 3 wavy lines crossing a circle, simple, distinctive, and terrifyingly familiar. Silas rocked back as if struck, the lantern nearly falling from his hand. He knew that mark. Had seen it branded on stolen cattle, scratched into the walls of hideouts, carved into the grips of guns. It was the mark of the Blackwater gang, his gang. From 30 years ago, when he'd been young and stupid and running with men who thought the law was something to ignore, and violence was the answer to every problem. Memories flooded back unbidden. Jake Morrison, the leader with his easy laugh and hard eyes. Tom Fletcher, who could shoot a playing card edge-on at 50 paces. Samuel Red Davis, who'd gotten his nickname from what he left behind after a fight. And half a dozen others, men who'd ridden together for 5 brutal years before Silas had run. They'd had hideouts scattered across 3 territories. Silas had known about most of them, line shacks, abandoned mines, caves in the Badlands. But not this. He'd never heard of any hideout here, never knew the gang had claimed this forest, this property, this tree. Yet here was proof. Their mark on a hidden door in a hollow tree on land he'd bought for his retirement. The coincidence was impossible. Nothing was that random, which meant what? That someone had led him here? That the deed seller had known? That some cosmic force had decided Silas Trent needed to face his past, whether he wanted to or not? He looked at Buck, standing quiet now at the clearing's edge. The horse watched him with those dark, knowing eyes. "You knew," Silas whispered. "Somehow you knew it was here." Buck didn't respond, but he didn't need to. The horse had been trying to tell him for 2 weeks, maybe longer. Maybe from the moment they'd first arrived, and Buck had sensed something about this tree that defied rational explanation. Silas turned back to the door. His hands trembled as he reached for the lock. It was rusted solid, but the hasp had weakened over the years. He could break it, could open this door and see what the Blackwater gang had hidden here 3 decades ago. But did he want to? He'd spent 30 years running from these men, from what they'd done, from what he'd done with them. He'd built a new life, nameless and alone, determined to die as someone different from who he'd been. Opening this door meant facing all of that. Meant acknowledging he could never truly escape. Meant accepting that Silent Trent was still part of him, would always be part of him, no matter how far he ran or how long he hid. The night air turned cold. Silas's breath came out in clouds. His knees ached from kneeling on hard ground, and his back protested the hours of digging. He was 62 years old, tired to his bones, and all he'd wanted was peace. Instead, he'd found a door to his past, buried in a tree. "Tomorrow," he said aloud, more to convince himself than anything. "I'll deal with this tomorrow." He stood, gathered his tools, and walked back to the cabin without looking at the oak again. But he knew he wouldn't sleep. Knew he'd lie on his cot staring at the ceiling, thinking about what might be behind that door, what the gang had hidden, and why fate or chance or Buck's inexplicable instinct had led him here. Tomorrow came with the first grey light. Silas stood on the porch, coffee cup forgotten in his hand, staring across the distance to where the oak waited in its clearing. No steam rose from his cup. He'd been holding it so long, the coffee had gone cold. He set it down carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter the morning's fragile quiet. Then he walked to his toolbox and selected the heaviest hammer he owned. The metal head was scarred from years of use, the wooden handle worn smooth by his hands. Buck nickered from the lean-to, but Silas didn't acknowledge him. Couldn't. If he stopped now, if he thought too much about what he was about to do, he'd lose his nerve. The walk to the clearing felt longer than it ever had before. The trees seemed to lean in, watching. The earth felt unsteady beneath his boots. Every step took him closer to 30 years ago, to the man he'd been, to secrets that should have stayed buried. The door waited, exactly as he'd left it, iron glinting dully in the early light. The Blackwater gang's mark seemed darker now, as if the night had fed it. Silas raised the hammer and brought it down on the lock. The impact rang through the forest, sharp and final, once, twice. On the third strike, the rusted hasp shattered, pieces falling away like dead leaves. The lock fell to the ground with a heavy thud. For a long moment, Silas didn't move. This was it. The last chance to walk away, to cover the door back up, to pretend he'd never found it. He could sell the property, move on, find somewhere else to hide. But Buck stood at the clearing's edge, watching. And the door hung open just a fraction, darkness visible in the gap. Calling to him with silent insistence, Silas reached out, fingers finding the rough edge of the iron, and pulled. The door swung open with a groan that sounded almost human. Behind it, stone steps descended into absolute darkness, leading down into whatever the Blackwater gang had hidden beneath this ancient tree. Silas stood at the threshold, lantern in hand, and stared into the darkness of his past. The stone steps were steep and narrow, carved from bedrock that predated the tree above. Silas descended carefully, one hand on the rough wall for balance, the other holding his lantern high. The light pushed back the darkness, but couldn't conquer it. Shadows pooled in corners and crevices like living things waiting for his attention to waver. 12 steps down, the passage opened into a chamber. The cellar was perhaps 15 feet across and 8 feet high, with walls of fitted stone and a ceiling braced by heavy timber beams. The air was surprisingly dry, carrying the musty scent of old wood and older secrets. Cobwebs hung in thick curtains from the corners, but there were no signs of water damage or collapse. Whoever built this had built it to last. Crates lined the walls, stacked 2 and 3 high. Wooden trunks with iron fittings sat among them. Shelves had been built into alcoves, holding jars and boxes whose contents Silas couldn't identify in the dim light. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a cache, a storehouse, a carefully organized repository of whatever the Blackwater gang had deemed valuable enough to preserve. Silas raised the lantern higher, letting its light sweep across the chamber. No rats, he noted. No signs of animals at all. The cellar had remained sealed all these years, a perfect time capsule of 1895. He approached the nearest stack of crates, setting his lantern on a trunk. The wood was dry and brittle, pulling apart easily when he pried at it with his knife. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, he found boxes of ammunition, still dry, probably still good. If anyone wanted 30-year-old cartridges, the next crate held tins of preserved food. Hardtack, salt pork beans, provisions for a long stay or a quick escape. The gang had been nothing if not prepared, but it was the trunk that drew him. Dark wood, brass fittings green with tarnish, and the initials J.M. burned into the lid. Jake Morrison, the leader, the man Silas had called friend. Silas knelt before it, suddenly reluctant. Opening crates was one thing. Opening Jake's personal belongings was another. That felt like violation, like grave robbing, though Jake had been dead for 30 years. Probably dead. Silas had never confirmed it, had never dared to look. He lifted the lid. Papers lay on top, neatly stacked and tied with string. Beneath them, clothing, shirts and trousers folded with military precision. Jake had been a cavalry scout before turning outlaw, and he'd never lost that discipline. Deeper still, Silas found personal effects. A pocket watch, its face cracked but still ticking in his mind's ear from memory. A harmonica Jake used to play around the campfire. A pair of spurs with silver inlay that had cost him 2 months' share of a robbery. And beneath it all, rolled and tied separately, a stack of wanted posters. Silas's hands shook as he untied the string. The paper crackled, brittle with age, as he unrolled the first one. Samuel Red Davis stared back at him from a crude sketch, younger than Silas remembered. Wanted for murder and robbery, 300 reward. The next poster showed Tom Fletcher. The one after that, Charlie Briggs. Silas had ridden with all of them, shared meals and bullets and the kind of trust that comes when men depend on each other for survival. He almost missed his own face. It was near the bottom of the stack, folded in half, as if someone couldn't bear to look at it. Silas spread it flat on the stone floor, and 30 years fell away in an instant. Wanted, Silas Silent Trent, for robbery and conspiracy. $500 reward, considered armed and dangerous. The sketch was surprisingly accurate. Whoever had drawn it had captured the set of his jaw, the way his eyes held no humor even when his mouth smiled. He'd been 29 then, lean and hard from years in the saddle. His hair had been dark, his face unlined, his hands steady as stone. Silent Trent. He'd earned that name not from being quiet, though he was, but from how he worked. While other outlaws whooped and hollered during robberies, firing guns into the air and shouting threats, Silas had moved through banks and trains like a ghost. Silent, efficient, terrifying in his calm. Men had given up money and valuables because the man holding the gun on them never blinked, never spoke, never showed a flicker of emotion that might be reasoned with. He'd been good at it, too good, and that had been the problem. Silas stared at the face looking back at him from yellowed paper. That man was a stranger now, someone he'd spent 3 decades trying to forget. But sitting here in a cellar that stranger had helped stock, surrounded by the gang that stranger had ridden with, Silas had to acknowledge a hard truth. You couldn't kill your past self. He was still in there somewhere, still part of the fabric of who Silas Trent had become. He set the poster aside and continued searching. More papers emerged from the trunk, letters mostly written in Jake's neat hand. Supply lists, routes marked on hand-drawn maps, records of robberies, dates, takes, splits. The gang had been organized, professional even, in their own brutal way. At the bottom of the stack, he found newspapers. Not wanted posters, but actual newspapers from towns throughout Wyoming and Colorado. Silas unfolded one, dated August 1895, and scanned the headlines. Blackwater Gang strikes again. Silver Creek Bank robbed, Marshall wounded. Silver Creek. The name hit him like a physical blow. That was the job, the one they'd been planning when he disappeared. The one Jake had been so certain about, that Red had pushed for, that Silas had known in his gut would end badly. He read quickly, absorbing details. The gang had hit the bank on August 15th, 1895. 3 men wounded, including Marshall Webb, $20,000 taken. The gang had escaped, but were believed to be heading north toward the Badlands. Silas calculated quickly. He'd run 3 days before the job, on August 12th, which meant they'd gone through with it without him, had found someone to replace him or split his share, and hit that bank exactly as planned. But something had gone wrong. Had to have. If the gang had escaped successfully with $20,000, they would have returned here for their cash. They would have retrieved these supplies, these weapons, these carefully preserved provisions, unless they couldn't, unless something had stopped them. Silas dug deeper into the newspapers looking for more. The next paper, dated August 20th, carried a headline that stopped his heart. Blackwater gang surrounded. Shootout ends in bloodshed. His eyes raced over the article. After the Silver Creek robbery, a posse had tracked the gang to an abandoned ranch near the Colorado border. The gang had fortified themselves in the ranch house, held off the law for 2 days, then tried to break out under cover of darkness. It hadn't worked. Tom Fletcher, shot through the chest. Charlie Briggs, killed instantly. Red Davis, wounded and captured. And Jake Morrison, the article said, had died leading the escape attempt, taking 3 bullets before he fell. Only 1 gang member was unaccounted for. One man who hadn't been at the ranch, who hadn't participated in the robbery, who the law suspected had either betrayed the gang or abandoned them before the job. Silas "Silent" Trent. The newspaper included speculation. Some thought he'd been killed earlier and the gang had hidden his body. Others suspected he'd turned informant and fled with a reward. The marshal quoted in the article had been clear. Silent Trent is wanted for questioning. If he's alive, we'll find him. Silas let the paper fall from his hands. They died, all of them. Jake, who'd been like a brother. Tom, who taught him to read trail sign. Charlie, who'd always had a joke even when things looked darkest. Even Red, wounded and captured, had died in prison, according to a later article, killed in a fight with another inmate 6 months after the trial, and they died thinking he'd betrayed them. The truth was worse. He hadn't betrayed them to the law. He'd simply been a coward. 3 days before the job, sitting around the campfire listening to Jake outline the plan, Silas had finally admitted to himself what he'd been avoiding for months. He didn't want to do this anymore. The violence, the running, the constant looking over his shoulder, it was eating him alive. But instead of saying so, instead of being honest with the men who trusted him, he'd slipped away in the night. Left his horse, took Buck from the remuda and rode hard for 3 days. Before even allowing himself to think, he'd told himself they'd be fine without him. Told himself 1 less gun wouldn't matter. Told himself that survival meant looking out for himself first. But he'd been wrong. Maybe his presence wouldn't have changed anything. Maybe they'd have died regardless. Or maybe, just maybe, Silent Trent's calm in crisis and deadly aim would have made the difference between escape and massacre. He'd never know. And that not knowing had haunted every day of the last 30 years. Silas looked around the cellar with new eyes. This wasn't just a cache, it was a memorial. The gang had built this place, stocked it, prepared it as insurance against bad times. They'd made plans to come back here, to regroup, to survive, but they'd never made it. And their preparation, their careful planning, their trust in each other and in the future had died with them in that ranch house in Colorado, all except for Silent Trent, who'd run before the bullets flew and lived to grow old while his brothers died young. He gathered the newspapers, the wanted posters and Jake's letters, his hands steadier now. This cellar held answers, but it also held judgment, evidence of the man he'd been and the men he'd betrayed through cowardice. But if there were answers here, there might also be absolution, or at least understanding. Some clue to why Buck had led him here, why fate or chance had brought him to this exact piece of land at this exact time in his life. Silas stood, picking up his lantern, and began a more systematic search of the chamber. Whatever other secrets the Blackwater gang had left behind, he would find them. He owed them that much. He owed them everything. The leather satchel was tucked behind a crate of ammunition, as if someone had placed it there specifically to keep it separate from the general stores. The leather was good quality, dark brown and barely cracked despite the years. Silas pulled it free and unbuckled the straps with fingers that had started trembling again. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, he found a book. Not printed, handmade. A journal bound in darker leather with pages of good paper stitched together. On the first page, in the careful script Silas remembered so well, were the words, "The personal account of Jacob Morrison, private, 1895. Silas carried the journal to the trunk he'd been using as a seat and settled in with the lantern close. His back ached, his knees protested, and exhaustion pulled at him like a physical weight. But he couldn't leave. Not now. Not when Jake's own words waited to be read. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1895. "We've acquired the forest property." Silent found it, actually, noticed it on a map while scouting routes through Wyoming. "Remote enough for our purposes, but with good access to 3 territories. We'll use it as a final fallback, a place to store what matters most. The others don't understand yet, but I believe we're approaching a crossroads. The West is changing. Law is spreading like frost. What worked 5 years ago won't work much longer," Silas read on, absorbed. The entries painted a picture of daily life with the gang, not the violence and robberies, but the mundane details that made them human. Arguments over cooking duties. Tom's terrible singing voice. Red's ongoing poker game with Charlie that had lasted 3 months. Jake's observations were often wryly humorous, sometimes melancholy, always clear-eyed about what they were and what they were doing. An entry from April caught his attention. "Silent has been different lately, quieter than usual, which is saying something. He sits apart in the evenings, watching the horizon like he's expecting something or someone. I asked him about it over coffee this morning. He just shook his head and said he was tired. But it's more than that. I've known him 6 years now. I've seen him face down armed men without breaking a sweat. I've watched him ride through gunfire like it was spring rain. But now there's something in his eyes I haven't seen before. Doubt, maybe, or conscience. Either one is dangerous for men like us." The words hit Silas hard. Jake had seen it, had known even then that Silas was pulling away. Yet he'd said nothing beyond that private question over coffee. Hadn't pushed, hadn't challenged, hadn't tried to hold him with guilt or threats. That was Jake's way, trusting his men to work through their own troubles. Silas had repaid that trust by vanishing in the night. He read forward, watching Jake's entries track the spring and summer of 1895. The gang had pulled 3 jobs in that time: a payroll coach, a mining company office, a train carrying bank transfers. All successful. All increasingly dangerous, and then in June, a name appeared that made Silas's breath catch. Silent is sweet on that cantina girl in Durango. Elena Martinez. I've known for 2 months, but didn't say anything. Figured it was his business. But last night I followed him when he slipped away from camp. He met her by the river, and I watched them talk for an hour. She's beautiful, I'll grant him that. Dark eyes, spirit to match. But more than that, she looks at him like he's something other than an outlaw, like he's a man worth saving. I think that might be the most dangerous thing of all for Silent. He's starting to believe he could be someone different. Silas closed the journal for a moment, pressing his palms against his eyes. Elena, God, he'd almost succeeded in forgetting her. Almost convinced himself over 30 years that what they'd had was minor, unimportant, easily left behind. But Jake's words stripped away that comfortable lie. Elena had been everything. The only person who'd seen past Silent Trent to the man underneath. The only one who'd made him believe redemption might be possible. He'd been 29 and she'd been 23, working at her uncle's cantina, serving drinks to cowboys and miners and occasionally to outlaws who knew enough to keep their business quiet. Silas had been drawn to her immediately, not just her beauty, though she was beautiful, but her strength. Life hadn't been easy for a Mexican woman in a Wyoming territory town. She'd faced prejudice, poverty, the constant struggle to be seen as human rather than as exotic decoration or convenient target. Yet she'd held her head high, worked hard, saved every penny, and treated everyone, rancher or outlaw, with the same measured courtesy until they proved they deserved something else. They'd talked first about nothing: the weather, the price of beef, the new marshal, and whether he was honest or bought. But gradually, over weeks and then months, the conversations deepened. She'd shared her dreams of opening a shop, maybe a small restaurant of her own. He'd admitted he was tired of running, tired of looking over his shoulder, tired of being Silent Trent. What would you be instead? She'd asked one night, standing by the river while the stars wheeled overhead. Just Silas, he'd answered. Just a man trying to make an honest living. Maybe with a woman who could stand me. She'd smiled at that, and in that smile he'd seen possibility, actual real possibility of becoming someone different, someone better. He opened the journal again, needing to know more. Jake's next entries about Elena were scattered but revealing. Silent rode into Durango again today. That's 3 times this week. The others are starting to notice, asking questions. I told them to mind their own business, but Red made a comment about silent thinking with something other than his head. I shut that down quick. Whatever Silent has with that girl, it's real. I can see it in how he carries himself, how he's pulled back from the planning sessions. He's looking for a way out, and part of me doesn't blame him. Another entry, dated July 10th, had a long talk with Silent tonight. Told him straight out that if he wants to leave, he should leave. No hard feelings, no recriminations. We've ridden together 6 years, and that counts for something. More than that, I consider him a friend. Maybe my best friend, though neither of us would say it out loud. But I can see the way this life is eating at him. Elena Martinez has shown him what he could have, and it's not compatible with riding with the Blackwater gang. I gave him my blessing to go. He thanked me, said he'd think about it. But I know he won't leave before the Silver Creek job. He thinks he owes us one more score. Silas had to stop reading. Tears blurred his vision, the first he'd shed in more years than he could count. Jake had given him permission to leave, had explicitly, generously released him from any obligation. All Silas had to do was ask. All he had to do was be honest. Instead, he'd run like a thief in the night. The journal continued, and Silas forced himself to read. The entries grew more focused as August approached. Plans for the Silver Creek job took shape. Jake laid out his concerns about the increasing risk, about Reds pushing for bigger and bigger scores, about the sense that their luck was running thin. We should stop after Silver Creek, Jake wrote on August 5th. Take our shares, disappear, start over somewhere the law hasn't looked yet. I've said as much to the boys, but Red wants to keep going. He's got a hunger now that wasn't there before. Sometimes I think he'd rather die in a blaze of bullets than fade into quiet obscurity. Maybe that's every outlaw's choice in the end. Die young and notorious or live old and forgotten. Silent, I think, has chosen life. The rest of us are still deciding. The final entries came in rapid succession. August 10th. Silent's been edgy, snapping at the others, keeping to himself. I asked if he wanted to talk. He said no, just tired. I didn't push. August 11th. Ran through the Silver Creek plan one more time. It's solid, but there's too many variables. The marshal there is smart, and the town's wealthier than most. They'll have good locks, maybe even a guard. But the take could be 20,000 or more, split 6 ways. That's enough to start over somewhere new. Silent said little during the planning. When I asked his opinion, he said it would work, but felt wrong. I asked what he meant. He couldn't say. August 12th. Silence gone. Slipped out sometime before dawn, took Buck with him. Didn't leave a note, didn't say goodbye. Part of me is relieved. Means he won't be with us at Silver Creek, won't risk his neck for money he doesn't want. But another part feels betrayed. Not because he left, but because he couldn't be honest about it. We've rode together 6 years, shared danger and brotherhood. If he wanted out, I'd already told him it was fine. But he left like he was ashamed, and that cuts deeper than I expected. The next line was added in different ink, clearly written later. We'll hit Silver Creek as planned. 5 guns instead of 6. It should be enough. And if Silence found something better, something worth living for, then good for him. One of us should make it out alive, that was the last entry. The journal's remaining pages were blank. Silas closed the book carefully, as if it were made of glass. Jake had understood, had known why Silas left, had even accepted it. But that final line, if Silence found something better, something worth living for, carried an assumption that was heartbreaking in its generosity. Jake had believed Silas left for Elena, left to build that better life they'd talked about, left to become just Silas instead of Silent Trent. The truth was smaller and uglier. Silas had left out of fear, pure simple cowardice. He'd meant to ride to Durango, to find Elena, to start that new life. But instead, he'd kept riding, away from the gang, away from Elena, away from everything, driven by the irrational certainty that association with him would destroy anyone who got too close. He'd never gone back to Durango, never sent word to Elena, just vanished into the West's vast emptiness and spent 30 years alone, convincing himself it was penance when it was really just more cowardice. And while he'd been running, his brothers had died at that ranch in Colorado, and Elena had been left waiting for a man who never came back. Silas stood, the journal in his hands, and looked around the cellar. Somewhere in here there had to be more evidence of the gang's final days, more clues about what happened after he left, more pieces of the story that had shaped the last 30 years of his life, and maybe, somewhere in these crates and trunks and carefully preserved supplies, there was something from Elena, some indication of what became of her, whether she'd waited, whether she'd moved on, whether she'd hated him for abandoning her. He set Jake's journal carefully aside and returned to his search. The cellar had revealed some of its secrets, but Silas sensed more remained hidden. And after reading Jake's words, after understanding the depth of the trust he'd betrayed, Silas knew he couldn't leave until he'd found them all. Some debts couldn't be paid, but they could at least be acknowledged. And maybe, in acknowledging them, Silas could begin to understand why fate or chance or Buck's mysterious instinct had led him here. To face the past he'd spent half his life trying to outrun. The photograph was in an ornate frame, tarnished silver wrapped around glass, that had somehow survived 3 decades without cracking. Silas found it in a wooden box tucked beneath the shelves, cushioned by layers of velvet cloth, as if someone had wanted to preserve it with particular care. He lifted it into the lantern light, and time collapsed. 7 people stood before a log structure Silas recognized as the old line shack they'd used before finding this forest property. The photograph was formal, staged, everyone positioned carefully, expressions serious in the way people held themselves when facing a camera's long exposure. Jake stood in the center naturally. Broad shoulders, confident stance, one hand resting on the gun at his hip. To his left, Tom Fletcher, tall and lean with that crooked smile he could never quite suppress. Red Davis on the right, shorter but thick with muscle, eyes hard even in the faded sepia. Charlie Briggs behind them and 2 others Silas barely remembered, gang members who drifted away before the Silver Creek job, and on the far edge, slightly separated from the group as if uncertain of his place, stood Silas himself. Younger, harder, with hollow eyes that revealed more than his impassive expression. He'd forgotten how thin he'd been then, how the violence and constant movement had whittled him down to bone and sinew and tension, but it was the 8th figure that made his hands shake. Elena stood beside him, just barely in the frame. Her hand rested on his arm, not possessively, but gently, almost protectively. She wore a simple calico dress, her dark hair pulled back, her face showing the same serious composure the men maintained. But her eyes, even in the photograph's grain and fade, held something different. Pride, maybe, or hope. She stood there among outlaws like she belonged, like she'd chosen to be captured in this moment with these dangerous men, because she'd chosen him. Silas traced his finger over her image, careful not to touch the glass. She'd been beautiful, but it was more than that. She'd possessed a strength that showed in the set of her jaw, the directness of her gaze. This wasn't a woman who'd be pushed around or dismissed. This was someone who'd decided what she wanted and claimed it despite the cost. And what she'd wanted, for reasons Silas had never quite understood, was him, The photograph must have been taken in the spring, maybe April or May. That would make sense. Jake had mentioned in his journal that the gang was preparing this hideout around that time. They'd have wanted a record, some proof they'd existed together at this moment, before the next job or the law or simple bad luck split them apart. Had Elena known what was coming? Had she sensed, as Jake apparently had, that Silas was pulling away? Is that why her hand touched his arm in the photograph, as if to anchor him to this place, this moment, this version of himself that included her? Silas turned the frame over. On the back, in handwriting he didn't recognize, someone had written, "The Blackwater Gang, Hidden Valley, Wyoming. May 12, 1895, a record for posterity. May 12th, 3 months before the Silver Creek job. 3 months before Silas had run, and the others had died." He set the photograph carefully on the trunk beside Jake's journal, creating a small collection of evidence. His own wanted poster, his best friend's private thoughts, and now this frozen moment showing all of them together, alive and whole, before everything fell apart. But these were fragments, pieces of a story he'd only seen from one side. He knew why he'd left, and now he knew that Jake had understood and forgiven him. But what about the others? What had Red and Tom and Charlie thought when they woke to find him gone? Had they cursed his name? Had they considered him a traitor? And more pressingly, more desperately, what had happened to Elena? She wasn't mentioned in the newspapers Silas had found. The articles about the shootout, about the gang's deaths, said nothing about a woman. But she'd been part of their circle, close enough to be in this photograph. Someone must have known about her. Someone must have recorded what became of her after the gang was destroyed and Silas vanished. For the first time since finding the cellar, Silas felt the pull of the outside world. Answers existed beyond this chamber, in town records and old newspapers and the memories of people who'd lived through those times. But seeking those answers meant risk, meant showing his face in public, asking questions that might trigger recognition, revealing an interest in the Blackwater Gang that could mark him as someone with personal connection to outlaws, hanged in the public consciousness as villains. Still, he had to know. The decision made, Silas climbed back up the stone steps into morning light that seemed harsh after the cellar's gloom. Buck waited at the clearing's edge, calm now, as if his purpose had been served. Silas touched the horse's neck in passing, then returned to the cabin to clean up and prepare. The nearest town was 20 miles south, the same place he'd bought supplies 3 weeks ago. Small, forgettable, the kind of place where people minded their own business out of necessity rather than courtesy. The general store, a saloon, a church, and a small building that served as both post office and informal library for anyone who cared about such things. It took Silas an hour to make himself presentable. He washed in cold water from the pump, shaved carefully, and put on his cleanest shirt. The man in the cabin's cracked mirror looked old, worn, but reasonably respectable. Certainly not like an outlaw from 30 years past. Time had weathered him into someone anonymous, and that anonymity was armor. The ride to town tested Buck's patience and Silas's nerve. Every rider they passed, every wagon traveling the opposite direction, brought a spike of irrational fear. Would someone recognize him? Would some old lawman or bounty hunter see past the years to the wanted poster beneath? But no one did. People nodded politely or ignored him entirely. And by the time Silas reached the town's single street, he'd almost convinced himself this was a routine errand rather than a dangerous search for truth. The building serving as library occupied the back room of the postal office. Silas tied Buck outside and entered through the front, nodding to the postal clerk, a young woman who barely glanced up from her ledgers. The library room was small, dusty, and gloriously empty of other people. Shelves held a sparse collection of books, but it was the filing cabinets against the back wall that interested Silas. Local newspapers, the sign above them indicated, dating back to 1870, organized by year, preserved on microfilm for anyone curious about history. Silas found 1895 and threaded the film into the reader with hands that wanted to shake. The first few months yielded nothing relevant. local news about weather, crop prices, and social events that seemed impossibly distant from his current concern. Then August. And there it was, exactly as he'd read in the Cellar's newspapers, but with more detail. Silver Creek Bank robbed. Blackwater gang strikes in daylight. Marshal Webb wounded. $20,000 taken. The article laid out the robbery's timeline. 5 men, masked and armed, had entered the bank at noon. They'd moved with precision, suggesting careful planning. 2 had held the customers and staff, while 3 emptied the vault. The whole operation took less than 10 minutes. Marshal Webb had responded to the commotion and been shot in the exchange of gunfire as the gang escaped. He'd survived, but the outlaws had vanished north toward the territory line. 5 men, not 6. Confirming what Silas already knew, they'd gone through with it without him. He scrolled forward, scanning headlines. August 17th brought the first mention of pursuit. A posse had been formed, led by federal marshals with authority across territory lines. The Blackwater gang was considered highly dangerous, and citizens were warned not to attempt apprehension. August 19th, gang cornered. Blackwater outlaws surrounded at abandoned ranch. Silas's mouth went dry as he read. The posse had tracked the gang to a ranch house 40 miles north of Silver Creek. The gang had fortified the building and refused to surrender. A standoff had lasted 2 days, during which the outlaws had fired on anyone who approached. Several posse members were wounded. The marshals had brought in additional men and surrounded the property completely. Then, on the night of August 18th, the gang had attempted a breakout. The article describing the shootout was graphic in its detail. Tom Fletcher had been killed in the first volley, shot from his horse before making 20 yards. Charlie Briggs had taken multiple wounds and died before dawn. Jake Morrison, leading the escape attempt, had been hit 3 times but kept fighting, trying to cover the others' retreat. He died at the ranch house door, the article said, still firing even as he fell. Red Davis had been wounded and captured. The article noted he'd been defiant during arrest, cursing the marshals and claiming the gang had been betrayed by one of their own. Davis specifically named gang member Silas "Silent" Trent as absent from both the robbery and the shootout. Marshal Stevens stated that Trent remains wanted for questioning regarding possible conspiracy with law enforcement. A reward of $500 stands for information leading to Trent's capture. Silas sat back, the words blurring. They died believing he'd betrayed them. Red had said it explicitly, probably said it to anyone who'd listened before he was hanged. And that belief had become part of the official record, part of the story told about the Blackwater gang's end. Silent Trent, the traitor, the turncoat, the one who'd sold out his brothers to save his own skin. The truth, that he'd simply been a coward, that he'd run from fear rather than for profit, almost seemed better than what they'd believed. At least cowardice was comprehensible. Betrayal was unforgivable. Silas forced himself to continue searching. More articles appeared over the following months. Red Davis's trial in September, his execution in early October. Editorial pieces about the Blackwater gang's reign of terror and the justice of their violent ends. Speculation about Silas Trent's whereabouts. Some thought he'd fled to Mexico, others that he'd been killed by the gang themselves before the final robbery. But nowhere, in any article, was there mention of Elena Martinez. No connection drawn between the gang and a cantina worker in Durango. No interview with anyone who'd known the outlaws' personal lives beyond their crimes. It was as if Elena had never existed in their story. As if she'd been so carefully protected, so thoroughly separated from the gang's activities, that even their destruction hadn't touched her publicly, which meant she might still be findable, might still be alive even now, 30 years later. She'd have been 53, not impossible to trace if she'd stayed in Durango or moved somewhere documented. Silas carefully rewound the microfilm, his heart hammering with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. Elena had been real. Their connection had been real, and unlike Jake and the others, she hadn't died in that ranch house in Colorado. She'd lived. And somewhere in the records, somewhere in this information age he didn't fully understand, there might be a trail leading to what had become of her. Whether she'd mourned him or cursed him, whether she'd moved on or waited, whether she'd kept their secret or shared it with the world. He had to find out. Not for closure, he didn't deserve that comfort, but for knowledge, for understanding, for whatever small measure of truth he could salvage from 3 decades of lies and cowardice and running. Silas left the library with a destination in mind. The town's small historical society, run by an elderly woman who'd lived in the area her entire life and had a reputation for knowing everyone's business. Across 3 generations, if anyone remembered what happened to a Mexican woman who'd loved an outlaw in 1895, it would be her. The historical society yielded nothing. The elderly woman, Mrs. Henderson, 84 and sharp as broken glass, had never heard of Elena Martinez. No Mexican woman by that name appeared in Durango's records from that era, she'd said with certainty. Perhaps Silas had the wrong town? Perhaps the wrong name? These things happened, especially with people who moved frequently or kept to themselves. Silas had thanked her and left, disappointment settling in his chest like a stone. But as he rode back toward the forest property, something nagged at him. Jake's journal had been clear. Elena worked at her uncle's cantina in Durango. But maybe she'd moved. Maybe, after Silas disappeared and the gang was destroyed, she'd left Durango for somewhere safer, somewhere without memories of outlaws and broken promises. The sun was setting by the time Silas reached the oak tree. Buck had already moved to his evening grazing, seemingly unbothered by the revelations the cellar had yielded. To the horse, the tree was just a tree again, its secrets exposed and therefore no longer worth circling. Silas lit his lantern and descended the stone steps one more time. In the harsh light of day and town visits, his search had seemed melodramatic, even obsessive. But here in the cellar's perpetual twilight, surrounded by the physical evidence of his past, it felt necessary. Critical even. He'd been thorough in his earlier exploration, or so he'd thought. But Jake's journal had taught him that the gang had been careful about what mattered most. The journal itself had been hidden separately, protected with extra care, which suggested there might be other items, other caches within this cache that required closer attention. Silas began again, slower this time. He examined the stone walls for hollows or loose stones. He checked beneath the crates for false bottoms. He ran his hands along the timber ceiling beams, feeling for carved-out sections. It was near the back corner, in a section he'd dismissed earlier as empty space, that his boot caught on something. He knelt, brushing away dust, and found a small wooden box flush with the floor. It wasn't hidden exactly, just positioned where shadows fell thickest and where the casual searcher might overlook it. The box was perhaps 8 inches square and 4 inches deep, made of good cedar that had weathered the years well. On the lid, carved with careful precision, was a name, Elena. Silas's hands trembled as he lifted the box. It was light, almost empty feeling. He set it on the trunk beside the photograph and journal, these artifacts of his past accumulating like evidence at a trial. The lid opened smoothly, hinges still functional. Inside, nested in velvet cloth gone grey with age, lay a silver locket. Silas lifted it carefully. The locket was beautiful, far more expensive than anything Elena could have afforded on a cantina worker's wages. The silver was worked with intricate patterns, flowers and vines, intertwining in designs with intricate patterns, flowers and vines, intertwining in designs that must have taken a craftsman weeks to complete. The chain was delicate but strong, meant to last. He remembered this locket. Elena had worn it always, tucked beneath her dress so only the chain showed. She touched it unconsciously sometimes, when nervous or deep in thought, her fingers finding it like a talisman. When he'd asked about it once, she'd said it was from her mother, the only thing of value her family had owned. But why was it here, in this cellar, instead of with Eleanor? Silas opened the locket with a fingernail, the catch releasing smoothly. Inside the left chamber lay a lock of dark hair, carefully coiled and tied with thread. Elena's hair, he assumed, or perhaps her mother's, a memento of family, of connection. But it was the right chamber that made his breath stop. A tiny sketch, hardly larger than his thumbnail, rendered in such fine lines he had to hold it close to the lantern to make out details. It showed a baby's face, round cheeks, closed eyes, a small mouth. Beneath the sketch, in writing so small it was barely legible, were two words: "Our Rose, our Rose." The cellar seemed to tilt. Silas sat down hard on the trunk, the locket still in his hand, staring at that tiny sketch. A baby, their baby. Elena had been pregnant. His mind raced backward, calculating. They'd been together from spring through early August. If she'd discovered the pregnancy in August after he'd left, she would have been maybe 2 or 3 months along. Not showing yet, not certain yet, but suspecting. Is that why she'd wanted to meet him at the hideout? Jake's journal had mentioned Elena coming here. Silas had interpreted it as her visiting the gang's territory, meeting with them socially. But what if it had been more specific? What if she'd planned to tell him about the baby here, in private, away from the gang and the town, and prying eyes? And he'd run the night before that meeting, had disappeared without word, leaving her alone, pregnant, probably terrified. Silas's hands shook so badly he had to set the locket down before he dropped it. A child! He had a child. Or had. The baby would be 30 years old now if she'd survived. Rose. Elena had named her Rose. He looked back in the box, desperate for more information. Beneath where the locket had lain, he found other items. Pressed flowers, dried to brittleness but still recognizable. Wildflowers from the hills around Durango. A ribbon, faded blue, the kind women wore in their hair. His old bandana, the red one he'd worn around his neck and had forgotten to take when he'd fled. Elena must have kept it, treasured it even, as evidence that what they'd had was real. And at the bottom of the box, a small leather pouch. Silas opened it, and coins spilled into his palm. Silver dollars, 10 of them. Then he found the folded paper bills beneath, 20 $10 bills, crisp and carefully preserved. $200 total. His breath came harsh in the quiet cellar. This was a fortune for a cantina worker. This was months of wages, maybe a year's worth, saved penny by penny. This was Elena's emergency fund, her escape money, the security she'd scraped together against hard times, and she'd left it here. In this cellar, in this box with her locket and his bandana and pressed flowers from their courtship. Why? Silas found the answer on a small piece of paper tucked in the box's corner. Folded so small, he'd almost missed it. He unfolded it carefully, and Eleanor's handwriting, bold and clear despite the paper's age, emerged. Silas, if you ever come back, if you ever find this place, know that I came here looking for you. Jake told me about the hideout before he left for Silver Creek. He said if anything went wrong, if you ever came back, you'd eventually find your way here. I'm leaving this box because I need you to know we have a daughter. Rosalena Trent, born March 3rd, 1896. She's beautiful and strong and has your eyes. I'm leaving money because I know you'll have nothing, and a man needs something to start with. The full letter is with what matters most. Find it, please. I've waited so long. The note wasn't dated, but the reference to Rose being born in March 1896 meant Elena had written this at least a few months after the birth, maybe longer. She'd come to this cellar, somehow found her way past the locked door, or maybe Jake had given her a key before the Silver Creek job. Some gesture of trust or contingency plan. She'd left evidence of their child and money for him to start over. And a cryptic message about a full letter hidden with what matters most. Silas read the note 3 times, absorbing each word. Rosalena Trent, his daughter, 29 years old, if she'd survived infancy, if she'd survived childhood, if Elena had managed to raise her alone while Silas drifted through the West, oblivious and self-pitying. The guilt that crashed over him was worse than anything he'd felt discovering the gang's deaths. Jake and the others had chosen the outlaw life, had known the risks, had died as they'd lived, with guns in their hands and defiance in their hearts. But Rose hadn't chosen anything. She'd been born into the consequences of his cowardice. raised without a father, marked by his absence, and Elena, God. Elena, she'd been pregnant and alone, her lover vanished. The gang he'd ridden with, destroyed and publicly vilified. She'd given birth by herself, raised their daughter by herself, and somehow found the strength to leave him this message of hope rather than hatred. The full letter is with what matters most. Silas looked around the cellar with new urgency. What had mattered most to the Blackwater gang? Money, certainly. But the money was in crates and pouches, scattered throughout the chamber. Weapons? Those were here too. Supplies for survival? Present in abundance. What had mattered most to Jake, specifically? He'd been the one to set up this cache, the one who'd understood they needed something beyond the immediate payoff. The journal had revealed his thinking. He'd known the outlaw life was ending, known they needed preparation for whatever came next. Silas's eyes fell on Jake's trunk. The journal had been there, carefully preserved. What else might Jake have protected with similar care? He pulled the trunk closer and removed everything he'd already examined. Clothes, personal effects, the wanted posters. At the very bottom, beneath a false bottom he'd missed earlier, he found what he was looking for, a Bible. Worn leather, pages thin from use, Jake's mother's name inscribed on the inside cover. Silas had seen Jake reading it sometimes, late at night, when he thought no one was watching. Jake had never spoken about religion, never made a show of faith, but he'd carried this book everywhere like a talisman against damnation. Silas opened it carefully. The pages were filled with underlined passages and marginal notes in Jake's hand. Verses about justice and mercy, about redemption and sacrifice. This had been Jake's private struggle, his wrestling with conscience in a life that offered little room for either. And there, hollowed out in the thick center section, was an envelope, sealed with wax, addressed in Elena's handwriting, for Silas when he finally comes home. Silas held the envelope in both hands, afraid to open it and equally afraid not to. This was the full letter Elena had promised. The complete story of what had happened after he'd fled, after the gang had died, after Rose had been born. This was truth, unvarnished and waiting. And once he opened it, once he read Elena's words, he would have to face not just what he'd done, but what he'd lost. The life he could have had, the daughter he'd never known, the woman who'd loved him enough to leave him one last chance at redemption. His hands steadied. Whatever the letter contained, rage or forgiveness, contempt or sorrow, he owed it to Eleanor to read it, owed it to Rose to know she existed, owed it to himself to finally, after 30 years of running, stand still and face what he'd left behind. Silas broke the seal and began to read. The paper was good quality, preserved perfectly in the Bible's protected hollow. Elena's handwriting flowed across the pages in that strong, clear script he remembered. No hesitation, no uncertainty. Just words laid down with the same directness she'd brought to everything. My dearest Silas, if you're reading this, it means you survived. It means you've finally found your way back to this place, to these memories, to the truth I've kept waiting for you all these years. I don't know if you'll come in a month, a year, or a decade. I don't even know if you're alive. But Jake said if you survived, if you ever felt safe enough to stop running, you'd eventually find your way here. He understood you better than you understood yourself. I'm writing this in the spring of 1897. Rose is a year old now, walking everywhere, getting into everything, laughing at nothing and everything. She has your eyes, Silas, that same grey-blue that changes with the light. The same quiet way of observing everything before deciding how to react. When she's concentrating, her face gets this serious expression that breaks my heart, because it's you looking out at me through our daughter's features. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to know what happened after you left. I went to the hideout on August 13th, the day after you disappeared. I'd asked you to meet me there, remember? Said I had something important to tell you. I'd been working up the courage for days. I was pregnant, Silas, 2 months along, though I wasn't certain yet. But my body knew, and my heart knew, and I needed to tell you before you did something stupid and dangerous. When I got there, you were gone. Buck was gone. Jake said you'd left in the night without explanation. He tried to soften it, said you'd probably needed to scout something or check on something. But I could see in his eyes he knew differently. You'd run, and I understood why, even as my heart broke. You'd been pulling away for weeks. I'd felt it every time we talked, every time I looked in your eyes and saw fear where there used to be certainty. You were terrified of becoming someone's husband, someone's father, terrified of being tied to this life, this place, this version of yourself you were trying to escape. So you ran from me the same way you'd been running from everything else. I didn't cry in front of Jake. I thanked him for his time, wished him luck with the Silver Creek job, and rode back to Durango. Then I cried for 3 days straight. The gang left for Silver Creek on August 14th. I heard about the robbery, then the chase, then the shootout. Every article in every newspaper, I read them all. Tom dead, Charlie dead. Jake dying at the ranch house door, still trying to protect his men. Red captured and executed. And you vanished, declared a traitor or a coward depending on who told the story. I knew you weren't a traitor. I knew you hadn't sold them out to the law. But I also knew you'd left them, left us all, and that the consequences of your leaving had been catastrophic. Still, I hoped you'd come back. Hoped you'd hear about the gang's destruction and return for me, for the baby I was carrying. I waited in Durango through my pregnancy, working at the cantina until I couldn't hide my condition anymore. My uncle was kind about it. More kind than I deserved, but the town wasn't. And how unwed Mexican woman with a baby. And a missing outlaw for the father. I wasn't welcome anymore. I moved to Santa Fe in December of 1895. Started over in a city where no one knew me, where I could claim to be a widow and raise our daughter without constant judgment. It was hard, Silas, harder than anything I'd faced before. I took in sewing, worked as a seamstress for wealthy families, saved every penny I could. Rose was born on March 3rd, 1896. The delivery was difficult. I was alone except for a midwife I barely knew, but she came into the world healthy and screaming and perfect. When I held her for the first time, I looked into her eyes and saw you. And I made a promise right then that I would never let her think she was unwanted or that her father was a villain. I told her about you, Silas. As she grew old enough to understand, I told her the truth. Not the sanitized version, but the real one. That you'd been an outlaw. That you'd made terrible choices. That you'd run when things got difficult. But also that you'd been struggling with conscience, that you'd wanted something better, that you'd been capable of love, even if you'd been too frightened to accept it. She grew up knowing her father was flawed, but not evil. Knowing you'd left, but that maybe someday you'd come back. I never remarried. Men showed interest, some kind, some not, but I couldn't. Part of me still loved you, despite everything. Part of me still hoped. Years passed. Rose grew into a beautiful child, then a thoughtful teenager, then a strong young woman. She's clever, Silas. So clever it sometimes scares me. She learned to read by age 4 and never stopped. Books became her escape, her joy, her way of understanding a world that hadn't always been kind to a half-Mexican girl with an absent outlaw father. She wants to open a bookshop. We've been saving together, planning it, dreaming about it. A place where people can lose themselves in stories, where her love of words can become something real and lasting. I think she'll do it. I think she'll build something beautiful out of everything we've survived. But here's the part I need you to know. The part I've waited so long to tell you. I'm sick. Silas, the doctors say my heart is failing. I've been saying it for 2 years now, though I've kept it from Rose as long as I could. She knows now, though. She's taking care of me with the same fierce determination she brings to everything. But we both know what's coming. I'm writing this letter in case I die before you return. In case you find this hideout 10 years from now, or 20, or never. I need you to know that Rose exists, that she's alive and well in Santa Fe, and that she deserves to meet her father if you're brave enough to face her. I've left her address at the bottom of this letter. She lives above a small bookshop on San Francisco Street. Not her shop yet, but she works there, dreams about it, plans for it. She's 27 now as I write this, still young enough to need family. old enough to understand complexity and forgiveness. If you find this letter after I'm gone, please don't waste the time you have left. Don't make the same mistake twice. Go to her, tell her who you are. Let her decide what she wants from you. But give her that choice, Silas. That's all I ask. One more thing I need to tell you. I never stopped loving you. Even when I was angry, even when I was alone and frightened and struggling to feed our daughter, even when years passed and hope faded, some part of me never stopped believing in the man I saw by that river. The man who wanted to be better. You made terrible choices. You ran when you should have stayed. You missed 30 years of your daughter's life, and there's no fixing that. But if you're reading this, it means there's still time. Time to meet Rose, to explain, to be honest in a way you weren't able to be before. Don't waste it. Please, Silas, don't waste what time you have left. With love, always, Elena Martinez Trent. Because I took your name in my heart even if I could never claim it in the world. P.S. Rose Elena Trent. Elena's Books and Stories, 242, San Francisco Street, Santa Fe. She's there most days. She has your eyes, your quiet strength, your way of seeing through pretense to truth. She's the best thing we ever created. Go to her. Silas read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning, new depths of loss and possibility. Elena had died. That much was clear from the letter's tone, from its careful instruction, from the way it read like a final testament. But Rose was alive. His daughter, 30 years old now if Elena had kept her dates current, was alive and living in Santa Fe, working in a bookshop, dreaming of opening her own, carrying his eyes and his quiet nature and Elena's strength. He had a daughter who knew about him, who'd grown up with stories of him, both the good and bad, who'd been prepared by her remarkable mother to face the possibility that her outlaw father might someday return. The question wasn't whether Rose existed. The question was whether Silas had the courage to face her. Elena's letter had been kind, far kinder than he deserved. She'd forgiven him, or come close enough to forgiveness that the distinction didn't matter. She'd understood his fear, his cowardice, his inability to be the man he'd wanted to be, but Rose didn't owe him that understanding. She'd lived her entire life without a father. She'd faced whatever hardships came with being a Mexican girl in the West, daughter of a seamstress and an absent outlaw with only her mother for support. Silas's return wouldn't undo any of that, wouldn't erase the birthdays he'd missed, the scraped knees he hadn't bandaged, the teenage fears he hadn't helped her navigate. He was 62 years old, worn down by hard living and harder memories. What could he possibly offer a 30-year-old woman who'd built a life without him? But Elena's words echoed, "Don't waste what time you have left." Silas carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in the Bible's hollow with the same reverence Jake must have felt handling this sacred book. Then he gathered everything, the letter, the locket, the photograph, the journal, the wanted poster, and climbed back up the stone steps. Buck stood in the clearing, silhouetted against the evening sky. The horse watched him emerge as if he'd been waiting, as if he knew the secret had finally been revealed. "You knew," Silas said, approaching slowly. "Somehow you knew this was here. Knew I needed to find it." Buck pressed his forehead against Silas's chest in that gesture of trust they'd developed. And Silas, standing in the shadow of the oak tree that had hidden his past for 3 decades, made a decision. He would go to Santa Fe, would find 242 San Francisco Street, would walk into Elena's Books and Stories and see his daughter's face for the first time. It might be the bravest thing he'd ever done, or the most selfish, or both at once, tangled together in ways he couldn't separate, but he would do it. Because Elena, dying and forgiving and still hoping, had asked him to. Because Rose, living and unknowing and carrying his eyes in her face, deserved the truth. Because 30 years of running had brought him here, to this moment, to this choice that couldn't be avoided or deferred. The sun set over the forest, painting everything in shades of amber and crimson. Silas stood with his hand on Buck's neck, watching the light fade, and prepared himself for a journey that had nothing to do with distance and everything to do with courage. Tomorrow he would begin making arrangements. But tonight he would sit with these revelations, these ghosts made flesh through ink and paper. Tonight he would mourn Elena and meet his daughter in his imagination, preparing himself for the moment when imagination would have to become reality. The oak tree stood silent above him, its secret finally revealed, its purpose finally served. And Buck, wise in ways Silas would never understand, grazed peacefully in the gathering darkness, his work complete. 3 days passed before Silas could make himself move beyond the clearing. He spent those days in a strange, suspended state, going through the motions of living while his mind circled the same questions endlessly. He fed Buck, tended the cabin, prepared meals he barely tasted. But mostly, he sat on the porch with Elena's letter in his hands, reading and rereading until he'd memorized every word, every loop of her handwriting, every place where the pen had pressed harder as emotion overtook careful penmanship. The arguments against going built themselves without effort. He was a wanted man, even if the wanted posters were 3 decades old. Someone might recognize him. Someone might connect the elderly drifter to Silas Trent. He could bring danger to Rose's doorstep just by appearing. More than that, what right did he have? He'd abandoned Elena pregnant and alone. He'd missed Rose's entire childhood, her whole life up to this point. Appearing now, old and worn and carrying nothing but regrets, what good could that possibly do? Wouldn't it be kinder to let her keep the sanitized version Elena had constructed, the absent father who'd at least tried to be better, rather than confronting her with the pathetic reality? Rose had built a life without him. Elena had raised a strong, capable woman who didn't need a father, showing up 3 decades late with apologies and empty hands. Maybe the greatest gift he could give her was continued absence. Maybe some doors once closed should stay closed, but every time Silas convinced himself to stay away, Eleanor's words returned, "Don't waste what time you have left." And there was the cough. He'd been ignoring it for months, but it was getting worse. Mornings brought up blood sometimes, just a little, easy to dismiss. His chest ached when he breathed deep. He got winded climbing the porch steps, exhausted after an hour's light work. A younger man might chalk it up to age, but Silas knew better. His body was giving him warnings, and men who ignored such warnings didn't get second chances. He was dying. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next month, but soon enough. The West had a way of wearing men down to nothing, and Silas had given it 62 years to work on him. Whatever time remained was measured in months, not years, which meant this decision wasn't about what was easiest or safest. It was about what was honest, about finally, at the end of everything, being the man he'd claimed he wanted to be when he'd stood by that river with Elena and promised her a better future. On the morning of the 4th day, Silas returned to the cellar one last time. He needed to close this chapter properly, to take what mattered and leave the rest as the memorial it had become. He descended the familiar stone steps, lantern in hand, and surveyed the chamber with new eyes. This wasn't his anymore, if it ever had been. This belonged to Jake and Tom and Charlie and Red and all the other men who'd died believing in brotherhood. However misguided their expression of it had been, let the historians find it someday, or let it remain buried forever. Either way, Silas would take only what he needed: Elena's letter, her locket, the photograph showing them all together, and Jake's journal. He was packing these items carefully when his boot struck something he'd missed in previous searches. A small leather pouch, wedged behind Jake's trunk, where it had probably fallen and been forgotten. Silas picked it up, feeling the weight of metal inside. The pouch opened to reveal a brass compass. Well-made, military issue, the kind cavalry scouts carried. Silas turned it over in his hands, watching the needle swing and settle, pointing north with unwavering certainty. On the back, engraved in neat letters, were 3 words: "True North always." This had been Jake's. Silas remembered seeing him consult it, remembered conversations around campfires about navigation and finding your way when landmarks failed. But Jake had used it as more than a tool. He'd talked about it as philosophy, as metaphor, A man can lose his way easy, Jake had said once years ago. Get turned around by greed or fear or just plain stupidity. But if he's got something to guide him back, something that points true no matter what, that's what saves him in the end. Tom had laughed, said Jake was getting philosophical in his old age. But Silas had understood. Jake had been talking about conscience, about moral direction, about knowing the difference between north and just wandering in circles. Silas closed his fist around the compass, feeling its solid weight. Jake had left it here in this place of last resort, as if he'd known someone would need it. As if he'd understood that finding your way out of darkness required more than just knowing which direction the sun rose. The compass settled something in Silas that 3 days of debate hadn't touched. Jake's voice, speaking across 30 years of death and silence, gave him the answer he'd been avoiding. Running from something doesn't change what it is. Facing it does. Silas had spent 30 years running, from the law, from his past, from himself. And all that running had brought him here, to this cellar, to these letters, to this moment where running was no longer possible because there was nowhere left to go. Santa Fe wasn't a destination. It was a direction. North, true north, toward honesty and accountability, and whatever small measure of redemption might still be available to a man who'd wasted most of his life being a coward. The decision made, Silas moved with purpose for the first time in days. He climbed out of the cellar, sealed the iron door as best he could, and covered it again with earth and leaves. Let it keep the gang's remaining secrets. He'd taken what belonged to him and Elena and Rose. The rest could sleep. Back at the cabin, Silas took stock of his possessions. Pitifully few, accumulated across 6 decades of drifting. Clothes, tools, the Winchester buck's tack, and maybe $40 in cash, tucked in various hiding places. Not enough to start a new life, but enough to make a journey and arrive presentable. The forest property would have to be sold or abandoned. He couldn't maintain it from Santa Fe, and Buck was too old for the journey, even if Silas had been capable of making it on horseback. The nearest neighbor, a quiet rancher named Carver who ran cattle on the adjacent land, had expressed interest in buying it if Silas ever wanted to sell. Silas rode to Carver's place that afternoon, Buck moving slow but steady beneath him. The negotiation was brief. Carver offered $500 for the land and cabin. Silas countered with a different proposal, $300 cash, and Carver takes Buck as part of the deal. The horse needs good pasture and light work, Silas explained. Needs someone who'll treat him right in his final years. Carver, a man in his 40s with kind eyes and the weathered look of someone who'd worked land his whole life, studied Buck carefully. Then he nodded. I've got good pasture. My daughter's been wanting a gentle horse. I'll treat him right. They shook on it, and Silas felt something crack inside his chest that had nothing to do with his failing lungs. Buck had been his one constant companion through 14 years of drifting. The horse had saved his life more than once, through loyalty and instinct, and a connection Silas had never fully understood, and now Buck had saved him again. By circling that oak tree until Silas had to investigate, by refusing to stop until the secret was revealed, by being, in his simple animal way, the compass pointing toward truth. The goodbye happened 2 days later, after Silas had packed his few belongings and prepared for the journey. He led Buck to Carver's ranch in the early morning, when the light was soft and the world was quiet. Buck seemed to understand. Horses always did somehow. He pressed his forehead against Silas's chest one last time, breathing slow and steady. And Silas wrapped his arms around that strong neck and let himself feel everything he'd been holding back. You did good, old friend, he whispered. Better than I deserved. You found what I needed to find, and now I've got to finish what you started. Buck nickered softly, then turned and walked to the pasture where Carver's daughter waited with an apple. No looking back, no hesitation. The horse had done his job and was ready for whatever came next. Silas watched him go, then turned toward town before grief could paralyze him. Some goodbyes had to be quick, or they'd never happen at all. The town 20 miles south had a general store where Silas bought new clothes. A proper shirt, Clean trousers, a vest that didn't have holes worn through the pockets. He paid for a bath at the boarding house, his first real bath in longer than he cared to admit, and sat in the hot water until his skin pruned and his muscles unclenched. The man who looked back from the barber's mirror afterward was startling. Clean-shaven, hair trimmed, wearing clothes that fit properly. He looked almost respectable. Old, certainly. Worn by weather and work and worry, but not obviously an outlaw. Not clearly a wanted man. Time had given him the best disguise possible, anonymity through age. The young man on the wanted poster and the elderly man in the mirror shared features, but 3 decades of hard living had changed him enough that recognition seemed unlikely. People saw what they expected, and no one expected Silas Trent to be a 62-year-old man buying train tickets in a backwater Wyoming town. The train station was small, just a platform and a ticket office attached to the telegraph building. Silas approached the window with his heart hammering, certain this was where it would all fall apart. The ticket agent would see through him, would recognize something in his eyes or his manner, would call for the marshal, but the agent, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, barely looked up. "Where to?" "Santa Fe," Silas said, his voice steadier than he felt. "That'll be through Denver, then south." $18. Silas counted out the money carefully. $18 was half his remaining cash, but it didn't matter. He wouldn't need money if he never arrived. The agent handed over the ticket and a schedule. "A train comes through tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock sharp. Don't be late, it won't wait." Silas thanked him and left before questions could be asked. He spent the night in the boarding house, lying awake in a narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Rose. What would she look like? Elena's letter said she had his eyes, but what else? Her mother's dark hair, certainly. Her mother's strength. But what of her manner, her voice, her way of moving through the world? Was she cautious like him, or bold like Elena? Did she laugh easily, or did she hold herself careful and guarded? Would she hate him on sight? Would she hear his name and turn away? Would she listen to his explanation and find it wanting, inadequate, unforgivable? Silas had no answers. Only the compass in his pocket pointing north. Only Elena's letter telling him not to waste time. Only the growing certainty that whatever happened in Santa Fe, whatever Rose's reaction, he had to try. The train's whistle woke him at 5:30, distant but growing closer. Silas dressed carefully, packed his small bag, and walked to the platform as the sun touched the eastern horizon. The locomotive emerged from the dawn, like something out of time, all steam and metal and forward momentum. It hissed to a stop, passengers disembarking, others climbing aboard. The conductor called out destinations: Denver, Colorado Springs, Pueblo, Santa Fe. Silas stood on the platform, ticket in hand, and felt the full weight of the decision pressing down on him. This was it. The moment where running stopped and facing began. Where 30 years of cowardice ended and whatever came next, redemption or rejection or something between, would start. He thought of Jake, dying at that ranch house door, still protecting his men. Of Vilena, raising their daughter alone, while Silas drifted in self-imposed exile. Of Rose, growing up fatherless because Silas had been too frightened to face himself, and he thought of Buck, circling that oak tree morning after morning, refusing to stop until the truth was revealed. The conductor called a final boarding warning. Silas stepped forward, climbed the steps, and found a seat by the window. The train lurched into motion, pulling away from the platform, from the town, from the forest property and the cellar and everything he'd been. Through the window, he watched Wyoming roll past, the same landscape he'd been drifting through for 30 years. But this time he wasn't running away. He was moving toward something, toward his daughter, toward truth, toward whatever remained of the life he might have lived if he'd been braver. The compass in his pocket pointed steadily north, and Silas followed. Santa Fe emerged from the high desert like a dream made of adobe and memory. The train had taken 3 days, with stops and transfers and long stretches, where Silas watched the landscape transform from Wyoming plains to Colorado mountains to New Mexico's stark beauty. He'd slept poorly in his seat, eaten little, and felt his body weakening with each passing mile. By the time the conductor called Santa Fe, final stop, Silas could barely stand without his chest seizing. The cough had worsened during the journey, bringing up blood he had to conceal in his handkerchief. Other passengers gave him concerned looks, but no one asked questions. The West had taught people to mind their own business, especially where sickness was concerned. He stepped off the train into afternoon heat that felt like a physical weight. Santa Fe was larger than he'd expected. Real streets, real buildings, people moving with purpose rather than the slow drift of frontier towns. This was a city, old and established, with Spanish colonial architecture mixed with newer territorial-style construction. Silas found his way to San Francisco Street by asking directions from a shopkeeper, his voice rough and his breathing labored. The walk should have taken 10 minutes, but stretched to 20 as he stopped frequently to rest, leaning against walls and pretending to admire the architecture while his lungs fought for air. Number 242 appeared on his right, and Silas stopped completely. The building was narrow but well-maintained. 2 stories of cream-colored adobe with a wooden door painted deep blue. The ground floor was clearly commercial space, with a large window displaying books arranged on stands and shelves. Above, residential windows suggested living quarters, but it was the sign that made Silas's throat close, with emotion more powerful than any illness, hanging above the door. Hand-painted wood with careful lettering, it read, "Elena's Books and Stories." Not Rose's shop. Elena's, named for the woman who'd died waiting for him, who'd raised their daughter alone, who'd never stopped believing he might return. Rose had honored her mother by giving the dream Elena had shared with her the name it deserved. Silas stood across the street, partially hidden by the shadow of a neighboring building, and looked through the window. The interior was warm and inviting. Shelves of books lit by late afternoon sun, a counter with a cash register, comfortable chairs positioned near the windows. A place designed for lingering, for discovery, for the quiet joy of losing yourself in stories. And there, behind the counter, was Rose. Even from across the street, even through window glass that caught the light, Silas could see Eleanor in her. The dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, the strong line of her jaw. The way she moved, with efficient grace, as she arranged books on a display table. But when she looked up, responding to something a customer said, Silas saw his own eyes looking back at him across 30 years and 2 generations. That particular grey-blue that shifted with the light. That steady, measuring gaze that took in everything before deciding how to respond. Their daughter. His and Elena's, real and alive and 30 years old, running a bookshop named for her mother in a city Silas had never visited. He watched her smile at the customer, genuine and warm. Watched her recommend a book, pulling it from a shelf with the confidence of someone who knew every volume in her collection. Watched her complete the sale and turn to straighten already straight shelves, occupying herself with the small tasks that filled a shopkeeper's day. She was beautiful, not in the fragile way some women were beautiful, but with the strength Elena had possessed. This was a woman who'd survived difficulties, who'd built something from nothing, who'd inherited her mother's determination and somehow, impossibly, her absent father's quiet resilience. Silas nearly turned away, nearly convinced himself that watching through the window was enough, that he could return to Wyoming or disappear into some other anonymous town and die quietly without disrupting the life Rose had built. But the compass in his pocket seemed to press against his ribs. Eleanor's letter whispered in his memory, and Buck's patient circling around that oak tree reminded him that some truths refused to stay buried, no matter how deep you tried to bury them. He crossed the street on unsteady legs, each step requiring more will than the last. The blue door loomed before him, solid and real, the final barrier between past and present, between coward and whatever he might become if he found courage one last time. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, a bright sound that seemed too cheerful for the weight of the moment. The shop smelled of paper and ink and old leather. Comforting scents that spoke of permanence and care, Rose looked up from her display table, and Silas saw her smile, the professional, welcoming smile of a shopkeeper greeting a potential customer. She didn't recognize him. How could she? She'd never seen his face except in her imagination, in whatever image Elena had created from stories and old photographs. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice carrying Elena's warmth but pitched slightly lower. "Welcome to Elena's books. Can I help you find something?" Silas tried to speak and couldn't. His voice had abandoned him, leaving only the wheeze of struggling breath and the hammering of his heart. He stood in the doorway, an old man in clean but cheap clothes, probably looking half mad from the journey and the emotion and the illness eating through him. Rose's expression shifted from professional welcome to genuine concern. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need to sit down?" She moved around the counter toward him, and the simple kindness of that gesture nearly undid him. She didn't know him, had no reason to care about an elderly stranger stumbling into her shop. But she cared anyway, because Elena had raised her to care, because compassion was built into her bones, the way cruelty was built into other people. Silas managed, his voice cracking. "I'm looking for Rose Elena Trent." Something flickered in her eyes. Wariness, perhaps. The slight tension of someone whose full name is known by a stranger. "I'm Rose. Can I help you?" Silas reached into his pocket with trembling hands. He pulled out the photograph, the one showing the Blackwater gang and Elena and his younger self, all of them frozen in sepia-toned permanence 30 years ago. He held it out to her, unable to find words that would make this easier, knowing there were no such words. Some truths had to land hard because soft landings were impossible. Rose took the photograph, her brow furrowing as she examined it. He watched recognition move across her face in stages. First, the woman at the edge of the group, her mother, young and alive, wearing the same determined expression Rose had inherited. Then the men, rough and dangerous in their period clothing, guns visible at their hips. And finally, her eyes settled on the young man standing beside Elena, whose hand barely touched his arm. Rose looked up at Silas, then down at the photograph, then up again. The color drained from her face. "Where did you get this?" Her voice had gone quiet, careful. "That's my mother." "Who are you?" Silas met his daughter's eyes and said the words he'd been rehearsing for 3 days. "She was your mother, and I'm your father." The photograph slipped from Rose's fingers, falling to the wooden floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the shop's quiet. She stared at him, her face cycling through expressions so rapidly he couldn't track them all. Disbelief, anger, shock. Something that might have been hope or might have been horror. "No," she said, the word emerging flat and hard. "No, you're not." "You can't be." "I am." Silas reached into his other pocket, pulling out the wanted poster, Jake's journal, Elena's letter. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped them all. "I have proof. Your mother left me a letter. She wanted me to find you." Rose took a step back, and Silas saw her gaze dart to the door, calculating distance, probably wondering if she should call for help or run herself. He didn't blame her. Some stranger walking into her shop, claiming to be the father she'd never met. The outlaw who'd abandoned her mother. It sounded like madness or a con. But then her eyes fell on the items in his hands, and professional distance gave way to desperate curiosity. "Let me see those." Silas handed them over one by one. Rose moved to the counter, setting each item down carefully. The wanted poster first. She examined it with the critical eye of someone comparing past to present, looking for resemblance in the weathered face before her and the hard young man in the sketch. The journal she opened more carefully, reading Jake's handwriting with increasing intensity. Silas watched her eyes widen as she found the entries mentioning Eleanor, mentioning Silent, mentioning the hideout and the Silver Creek job, and the complex web of loyalty and betrayal that had defined those final months. But it was Elena's letter that broke her. Rose picked it up with hands that had started trembling to match his own. She read it standing, then moved to one of the chairs by the window and sat down hard, still reading, her breath coming faster. Tears started halfway through. By the time she reached the end, they were streaming freely down her face, and she made no effort to wipe them away. She knew, Rose whispered, rereading the final paragraphs. She knew she was dying, and she wrote this for you. She believed you'd come back. I didn't know, Silas said, his voice rough with emotion and illness. I didn't know about you until 10 days ago. I found the letter in the cellar your mother described, and 10 days. Rose looked up at him, anger finally surfacing clear and sharp. You found out about me 10 days ago, and you waited. You had a daughter for 30 years, and when you finally learned about it, you waited. I was afraid, Silas admitted. I've been afraid my whole life, and it cost me everything. It cost you a father. It cost your mother the life she deserved. I waited because I'm a coward, and I nearly waited too long again. The honesty seemed to surprise her. She'd expected excuses, probably, or justifications. Not this raw admission of failure. Sit down, she said, and Silas realized she'd noticed how heavily he was leaning on the counter. You look like you're about to fall over. He moved to the chair beside hers, lowering himself carefully. Rose stood, locked the shop door, and turned the sign to closed. When she returned, her face had settled into something harder, more guarded. Tell me everything, she demanded. Why you left, where you've been, why you didn't come back for her. All of it, and don't leave anything out, so Silas told her. Not the sanitized version, not the story that made him sympathetic or forgivable. The truth, his years with the Blackwater gang, the violence he'd been part of, the robberies, the reputation he'd built as Silent Trent, his growing moral crisis as the gang's activities escalated. Meeting Elena and seeing in her eyes a version of himself that might still be worth saving. He told her about running the night before the Silver Creek job, about spending 30 years drifting alone, punishing himself through isolation, but never having the courage to face what he'd done. About buying the forest property as a place to die quietly, and Buck circling that oak tree until the past caught up with him. Rose listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she sat in silence for a long moment. You left her pregnant, she finally said. You didn't just leave the gang. You left her carrying your child, and you never came back, never sent word. She raised me alone, working herself to exhaustion, and you were just, what? Wondering. Feeling sorry for yourself? Yes. Silas didn't flinch from it. That's exactly what I was doing. And there's no justification for it. No excuse that makes it right. And now you're here because you're dying. It wasn't a question. Rose had seen the blood on his handkerchief when he'd coughed, had noticed the grey pallor beneath his weathered skin, had recognized mortality when it walked through her door. Yes, he admitted. I'm sick. Have been for a while. I don't know how long I have, but it's not long. Rose's anger cracked, revealing something more complicated beneath. She looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw her wrestling with contradictions. The father she'd imagined, the reality sitting before her, the mother's letter that had forgiven him, and her own fierce need for both justice and connection. I don't forgive you, she said, each word deliberate. Not yet. Maybe not ever. You don't deserve forgiveness just because you finally showed up, I know. But her voice broke slightly. But I want to know you. My mother spent 30 years telling me about you, about who you were before fear made you run, about the man you could have been. And now you're here and she's not, and I'm losing you just as I found you. And it's not fair. Tears threatened again, and this time Rose did wipe them away, angry at herself for crying, angry at him for making her feel anything at all. She loved you, Rose continued, pulling a small cigar box from beneath the counter. Even after everything, she loved you. Look, she opened the box, revealing treasures carefully preserved. Letters Elena had started writing to him, but never sent. Small items Rose didn't recognize. And a piece of paper, yellowed with age and folded carefully. Rose unfolded it, and Silas saw a child's drawing. 3 figures rendered in careful crayon, a tall woman labeled Mama, a small girl labeled Me, and a man standing slightly apart labeled Papa. I drew this when I was 6, Rose explained. I asked Mama what you looked like, and she described you. I drew this family, the one I imagined we were supposed to be. She kept it all these years. Silas took the drawing with hands that shook. The child's version of him was smiling, holding the little girl's hand. A fantasy family created by a daughter who'd never known her father but imagined him anyway, as someone kind and present. What was she like? Rose asked, her anger softening into something more vulnerable. Really like, I mean, not just the stories I grew up with, but the real woman you knew. So Silas told her about Elena, not the saintly version a daughter might want to hear, but the complicated, strong, sometimes frustrating woman he'd loved. Her laugh that came from deep in her chest, her stubbornness that matched his own, her dreams of a better life and her pragmatic approach to achieving them. The way she'd seen through his outlaw reputation to the frightened man underneath and had loved him anyway. Rose cried as he spoke, mourning her mother all over again but with new details, new dimensions to the woman who'd raised her. Silas's stories gave Eleanor back to her in a way more complete and human than memory alone could manage. When he finished, Rose sat quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I don't forgive you. Not yet, but I want to know you. While there's time, I want to understand who you are, not just who you were. And maybe," she hesitated, "maybe we can figure out what we're supposed to be to each other." Silas felt something release in his chest that had been locked tight for 3 decades. Not forgiveness, he didn't deserve that, but possibility. A chance to be known by his daughter, to give her whatever truth and time he had remaining. "I'd like that," he said simply. Rose stood, moving behind the counter to compose herself. When she turned back, her face was set with determination that reminded him painfully of Elena. "You can stay," she said. "I have a spare room upstairs. We'll start there. You'll tell me everything, all the stories, all the truth, and we'll see what happens." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was more than Silas had dared hope for. Autumn settled over Santa Fe like a blessing. The cottonwoods along the streets turned gold, and the air carried that particular crispness that promised winter without threatening it. Silas sat in the chair by the window of Elena's books and stories, a blanket over his knees despite the afternoon warmth, and watched his daughter work. 2 months had passed since he'd walked through that blue door. 2 months of careful conversation, of stories shared slowly, of trust built word by word and day by day. Rose had given him the spare room above the shop, small but clean, with a window overlooking the street and a bed more comfortable than any he'd slept in for years. His health had continued its decline, but Rose had found a good doctor who provided medicine that eased the worst symptoms. He wouldn't recover, they both knew that, but the doctor had given him time. Months, maybe longer if he was careful. Enough to matter. The rhythm of their days had settled into something almost normal. Silas would wake early, make coffee in the small kitchen Rose maintained upstairs, and descend to the shop before it opened. He'd sit in his chair, reading or just watching the street come alive, while Rose prepared for the day. When customers arrived, he'd observe her work with quiet pride, her knowledge of books, her patience with difficult customers, her genuine joy in connecting readers with stories they'd love. They talked between customers. Small conversations at first, about weather and books and the neighborhood. Then deeper ones, about Elena and the gang and Silas's years of drifting. Rose asked questions others would consider invasive, and Silas answered with honesty that still felt foreign after decades of evasion. "Tell me about the worst thing you did," she'd asked one afternoon. Her directness so like Elena's, it had stolen his breath. He'd told her about a stagecoach robbery where the guard had been shot, probably died, though Silas had never confirmed it. About knowing it was wrong even as he'd participated. About the weight of that choice following him through 30 years of trying to forget. Rose had listened without judgment, then said, "Thank you for not lying to me." That simple gratitude had meant more than absolution would have. The breakthrough came 6 weeks in, over breakfast in the small kitchen. Silas had been telling her about Buck, about the horse's patient circling of that oak tree, when Rose had laughed, genuine and delighted, and said, "That's the kind of stubborn you passed down. Dad, I get that from you, Dad." She'd said it casually, as if the word had been waiting for the right moment to emerge naturally. Silas had frozen, coffee cup halfway to his lips, and Rose had blushed. Is it okay if I... It's okay, he'd managed, setting the cup down before his shaking hand spilled it. It's more than okay. After that, the word came easier. Not constantly, not forced, but naturally in conversation. Dad, what do you think of this display? Dad, tell me more about Wyoming. Dad, there's a customer asking about Western history. Want to help? In return, Silas taught her what he could. How to read weather in the clouds and wind. How to track animals by the signs they left. How to start a fire with damp wood. Navigate by stars. Judge distances in open country. Skills from a life she'd never lead, but knowledge connecting her to a heritage she'd been denied. One evening, Rose had shown him her own writing. Stories she'd been working on for years, kept private because she'd never felt they were good enough. Silas had read them slowly, his reading skills adequate but unpracticed, and found them beautiful. Tales of the West told from perspectives he'd never seen. Women surviving alone, mixed heritage children finding their place, outlaws seeking redemption they'd never quite reach. You inherited Elena's strength, he'd told her, but you got something of your own too. The ability to see truth in complexity, to write about hard things with compassion. Rose had cried then, and Silas had held his daughter for the first time, both of them mourning everything they'd missed while being grateful for what remained. The visit to Elena's grave happened on a Sunday in October. Rose had suggested it carefully, knowing it would be difficult for them both. The cemetery sat on a hillside overlooking the city, peaceful and well-maintained. Elena's headstone was simple. Elena Martinez, 1872-1920, beloved mother, dreamer friend. Silas knelt before it with difficulty, his knees protesting, and placed his hand flat against the stone. I'm sorry, he whispered, for all of it. For running, for wasting time, for not being the man you believed I could be. Rose knelt beside him, her hand joining his on the stone. She forgave you, she said quietly. The letter proves that. She wanted you to have this chance, wanted us to have it. Don't waste her gift by drowning in guilt. They'd stayed there an hour, Rose sharing memories of her mother that Silas would never have otherwise known. Elena teaching her to read. Elena's steady hands sewing late into the night. Elena's stories about a man who'd once loved her, who'd been flawed but trying, who Rose should never hate, because hatred was too heavy a burden for any child. I understand now, Rose had said as they prepared to leave. Why she never stopped believing in you. You were worth saving. You still are. That evening, back at the shop, they'd talked about the future in practical terms. The forest property remained in Silas's name, though he hadn't returned. Rose wanted to see it, to visit the place where her parents' story had intersected with history. Next spring, Silas suggested, when the weather's good and I'm stronger. We'll go together. I'll show you Buck. He's doing well at Carver's place, according to the letters. And you can see the oak tree, the cellar, all of it. Rose had agreed, though they both knew spring was optimistic. Silas's coughing had worsened despite medication, and there were days he couldn't leave his chair. But planning gave them something to hope for, and hope was its own kind of medicine. They decided to contact the New Mexico Historical Society about the cellar's contents. Jake's journal, the gang's papers, the artifacts, they belonged to history, not hidden in darkness. But the personal items, Elena's locket, the photograph, Rose's childhood drawing, those would stay with them. Some things were too precious for strangers' eyes. Now, sitting in his chair as November approached, Silas watched Rose help a customer select a book and felt something he'd never expected to feel again. Contentment. Not happiness exactly. The weight of his mistakes and Elena's absence made pure happiness impossible. But peace. The sense of being exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do in whatever time remained. What are you thinking about? Rose asked during a quiet moment, settling into the chair beside his. Regrets, he answered honestly. What I'd change if I could, and I can't change any of it. The running, the missing your childhood, the years Eleanor spent alone. But I can be here now. I can know you now. That doesn't erase the past, but it means the past doesn't have to define everything. Rose took his hand. She'd become comfortable with casual touch over these months, a gift Silas cherished. "You know what Mama used to tell me? She'd say that redemption isn't erasing your mistakes. It's finally having the courage to face them and become someone different. She was a wise woman. She was. And she was right about you. You're different than you were, than you've been." A customer entered, bell chiming, and Rose rose to greet them. Silas watched her work, this daughter he'd found too late and just in time, and thought about Buck. The horse had known, somehow, that beneath that oak tree lay answers Silas needed. Had circled and circled until Silas had no choice but to investigate, to dig, to face what he'd buried. Buck had saved him in the end. Not from danger or death, those were coming regardless, but from dying without ever knowing his daughter. From dying alone when he could die connected. From dying a coward when he could die someone who'd at least tried at the very end to be brave. The light shifted as afternoon moved toward evening, painting the bookshop in shades of amber and gold. Rose returned to sit beside him, and they fell into the comfortable silence they'd developed. No need for constant conversation, just the peace of shared presence. "I'm glad you came," Rose said eventually. "I'm still angry sometimes about all we missed." "But I'm glad you finally came." "So am I," Silas answered. "So am I." Outside, someone passed with a camera, the new portable kind that was becoming popular. Rose called out, asking if they'd take a photograph. The stranger agreed, and Rose pulled Silas to his feet, supporting him as they stood before the shop's blue door. Beneath the sign reading Elena's Books and Stories. "Smile," Rose instructed, and Silas tried, though it felt rusty and uncertain. The flash popped. The stranger handed Rose a card with the studio's address, where they could collect the developed photograph. Rose thanked them, then helped Silas back to his chair. A week later, the photograph arrived. Silas studied it carefully. An old man and a young woman standing together, his hand on her shoulder, her smile genuine despite the sadness in her eyes. Not the family photograph that should have existed 30 years earlier, but the one that was possible now. A record that they'd found each other, however late, however briefly. Rose had it framed and placed it on the counter where customers could see it. No explanation, just a photograph of a father and daughter in front of a bookshop on an autumn afternoon in Santa Fe. Silas Trent had spent 30 years running from ghosts. In the end, facing them, facing himself, had been the only way to find peace. The past couldn't be changed or erased, but it could be acknowledged, learned from, and finally set down. Some doors once opened led not to destruction, but to grace. Some circles endlessly walked led eventually to truth. And